exploring the top 10 countries with the highest HIV/AIDS cases. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into a topic of paramount importance: global health. Specifically, we'll be discussing the top 10 countries with the highest HIV/AIDS cases. This is a serious issue that affects millions of lives worldwide, and understanding the situation can help us raise awareness and promote prevention and treatment efforts. So, let's get started. Russia is the 10th country with the most HIV cases in the world, with an estimated 1 million people living with HIV in 2020. Russia has one of the fastest-growing HIV epidemics in Europe and Central Asia, driven mainly by injecting drug use and sexual transmission. According to HIVAIDS, only 36% of people living with HIV in Russia were receiving antiretroviral therapy in 2020, which is far below the global average of 73%. Russia also faces challenges such as stigma, discrimination, human rights violations, and lack of funding for HIV programs. Zimbabwe is the 9th country with the most HIV cases in the world, with an estimated 1.3 million people living with HIV in 20,201. Zimbabwe has one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in sub-Saharan Africa, at 11.9% among adults aged 15 to 49. However, Zimbabwe has also made significant progress in reducing new infections and deaths from AIDS-related illnesses, thanks to a strong national response and support from international partners. In 2020, 86% of people living with HIV in Zimbabwe were receiving ART, and 86% of pregnant women living with HIV received medicines to prevent mother-to-child transmission-free. Moving on, Kenya is the 8th country with the most HIV cases in the world, with an estimated 1.4 million people living with HIV in 2020. Kenya has a generalized HIV epidemic, meaning that it affects all segments of the population, but some groups are more vulnerable than others, such as sex workers, men who have sex with men, and people who inject drugs. Kenya has implemented various strategies to prevent and treat HIV, such as voluntary medical male circumcision, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and test and treat approach. In 2020, 79% of people living with HIV in Kenya were receiving ART, and 85% of pregnant women living with HIV received medicines to prevent mother-to-child transmission. Uganda secures the 7th position with the most HIV cases in the world, with an estimated 1.4 million people living with HIV in 2020. The nation was one of the first countries in Africa to experience a severe HIV epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s, but also one of the first to adopt a comprehensive and multisectoral response that led to a decline in prevalence and mortality. However, Uganda still faces challenges such as high rates of new infections among young people and key populations, low coverage of prevention services, and stigma and discrimination. In 2020, 77% of people living with HIV in Uganda were receiving ART, and 95% of pregnant women living with HIV received medicines to prevent mother-to-child transmission. At number 6 we have Zambia, with an estimated 1.5 million people living with HIV in 2020. Zambia has a generalized HIV epidemic, affecting both urban and rural areas, but some regions have higher prevalence than others. Zambia has made remarkable achievements in scaling up access to ART, reaching more than 90% of people living with HIV in 2020. Zambia has also implemented innovative approaches to reach key populations and improve service delivery, such as self-testing kits, mobile clinics, and community-based models. Moving on to the 5th country we have Nigeria, with an estimated 1.7 million people living with HIV in 2020. Nigeria has a low national prevalence of 1.3%, but due to its large population size, it accounts for about 9% of all people living with HIV globally. Nigeria's epidemic is concentrated among key populations such as sex workers, men who have sex with men, and people who inject drugs. Nigeria has made efforts to increase access to testing and treatment services for these groups, as well as for pregnant women and children. In 2020, 64% of people living with HIV in Nigeria were receiving ART, and 59% of pregnant women living with HIV received medicines to prevent mother-to-child transmission. Entering the top 4, we find Tanzania, with an estimated 1.7 million people living with HIV in 2020. Tanzania has a generalized HIV epidemic, with variations across regions and districts. Tanzania has adopted a combination prevention strategy that includes biomedical, behavioral, and structural interventions, such as male circumcision, condom promotion, and social and legal reforms. In 2020, 74% of people living with HIV in Tanzania were receiving ART, and 93% of pregnant women living with HIV received medicines to prevent mother-to-child transmission. In the bronze position, we have Mozambique, with an estimated 2.1 million people living with HIV in 2020. The country has a generalized HIV epidemic, with higher prevalence among women, young people, and key populations. Mozambique faces multiple challenges such as poverty, gender inequality, low literacy, weak health systems, and natural disasters that affect its HIV response. In 2020, 66% of people living with HIV in Mozambique were receiving ART, and 82% of pregnant women living with HIV received medicines to prevent mother-to-child transmission. At the second position, we have India, with an estimated 2.3 million people living with HIV in 20,201. India has a low national prevalence of 0.2%, but due to its large population size, it accounts for about 6% of all people living with HIV globally. India's epidemic is concentrated among key populations such as sex workers, men who have sex with men, transgender people, and people who inject drugs. India has made significant progress in reducing new infections and deaths from AIDS-related illnesses, as well as expanding access to testing and treatment services. In 2020, 79% of people living with HIV in India were receiving ART, and 85% of pregnant women living with HIV received medicines to prevent mother-to-child transmission. South Africa is at the top spot as the country with the most HIV cases in the world, with an estimated 7.8 million people living with HIV in 2020. South Africa has one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world, at 19.1% among adults aged 15 to 49. South Africa also has the largest ART program in the world, reaching more than 90% of people living with HIV in 2020. South Africa has implemented various interventions to prevent new infections and improve quality of life for people living with HIV, such as voluntary medical male circumcision, PrEP, test and treat approach, and social protection schemes. That's it for today's video. I hope you learned something new and interesting about the top 10 countries with the most HIV/AIDS cases in the world. It's important to note that these numbers are subject to change due to various factors. If you found this video informative, give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Stay informed, stay healthy, and remember to support initiatives that aim to combat this global health challenge. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.